Greetings, heroes. It is I, your friendly neighborhood rabbi, connecting the intertube so that we could talk live today about the Torah portion of the week, Parashat Shemini, which means eighth, and because they said on the eighth day of something, we did something. And so we're going to get to that in just a second. Specifically today, I want to talk about keeping kosher. And this isn't for everybody. You know, it's this gift that's given to us by God for Bnei Israel, for the Jewish people. It's not like everybody has to eat like this, but this is part of our covenant that God said there are certain animals you should eat and certain animals you shouldn't eat. You know, or let me rephrase that. If you're going to eat animals, here's the approved animal list and here's the disapproved animal list. This is what's on the menu if you're not going all vegetarian or vegan, stuff like that. So a lot of people raise the question of why do we do this? Why bother? Were these rules instituted for a particular people in a particular time that no longer apply for like hygienic or scientific reasons? Some people are satisfied that some people are satisfied by that. Some people are not. So we're going to talk about various reasons why you might like to choose to do this in your own life and what benefits it might have for you. But just so you know, if you're joining me for the first time, this isn't a regular, like, quick 90-second, 5-minute, 10-minute YouTube video. This is a live studio recording for the Jew Curious Show podcast. So God willing, as soon as I can edit all these podcasts that we've been producing live, this will appear in the Jew Curious Show in podcast form, carefully sound cleaned and edited, but the benefit of being here live is y'all get to catch all the bloopers. So we're going to do a live studio recording. I'm going to do my level best to teach just as articulately and concisely as I can, but sometimes in this live format we make mistakes, by which I mean this guy makes mistakes. Sometimes I'll repeat myself. Sometimes I'll have a little brain fog and bleep, blop, bloop, and I'll have to edit that out for the podcast. But the benefit of doing this live is that I get to take people's questions who are watching now and are on the chat and can ask me those questions live. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to learn with students live. I like making podcasts. People listen, people give me feedback and give me ideas for new episodes. But what I really love to do is learn with people on the fly, learn with people live so that people can ask me their questions and I can answer them live, unrehearsed, and give the very best answers that I can. And really the reason I encourage people to join me for these live sessions is I can teach all day and teach, you know, what I think people should know or what I think people might want to know. But only when people ask questions do I know the questions that are really on people's minds. And the reason I encourage people to ask questions is I fully believe that if you have a question, there's probably a lot of other people out there who have that question as well. So when you ask the question, you're not only doing yourself a favor to get an answer to a question that you have, you're doing other people a favor, because if they have that question, they get an answer too. So it's a really generous act in Jewish tradition to ask questions because you satisfy your curiosity. Maybe it inspires another question, but other people get to learn as well from your curiosity. And so I really appreciate the people who are joining us live. We're racking them up. We're not at Minion yet, but we're almost there. We've got Kathy from California is here. Abigail Truman, welcome. Nice to see you here. And so in just a minute, we're going to get started with the podcast recording. Just as a reminder for people who are joining us today, we were talking about not only the Parashat Hashavua of Parashat Shemini, the third Torah reading in the book of Sefer Vayikra, or the book of Leviticus, but specifically, we're going to focus on the part of the Parsha. It's Leviticus chapter 11 that talks about what animals are fit for the consumption of Bnei Israel and what are not and why, perhaps. But more importantly, I want to address today a theory that I have of why it's a good idea to follow the Jewish dietary guidelines. And so we'll get to that in just a second. I see Miriam has joined us. Welcome. I think Miriam's coming in from New Hampshire, if memory serves. Sometimes it doesn't. Edith is here from New York. Wonderful, wonderful. This is why I like to do it at 9 a.m. Pacific time, because we get a lot of people joining us at 9 a.m. Pacific time from the West Coast, but also it's lunchtime in the East Coast. So we get people coming in from Florida. We get people coming in from New York City, as we say in Texas in the Pace Picante commercials. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So what I'm going to do first is a little bit of the podcast intro. I'm going to put on my radio voice so that I can get this recorded for the podcast, minimal re-recording and editing later, just to have an efficient process. Hey, William, good to see you here from Waukeeva Springs, Florida. So let's do this. You got to clean out the pipes here. Red leather, yellow leather, unique New York. She sells seashells by the seashore. Rubber baby buggy bumpers. And a little bit of sip of the rocket fuel here. Let's see. Abigail Truman is coming in. She says it's 5 p.m. where she is. Where are you coming in from, Abigail? It's nice to see you here. Are you in jolly old England? Are you in the Emerald Isle of Ireland? I don't know, but I'm happy you're here in any case. So let's get into this. Hero, have you ever wondered why being Jewish comes with a diet plan? In today's episode, we are going to talk about the Torah portion of the week, Parashat Shemini, the third Torah reading in the book of Leviticus, which gets into the Jewish dietary laws. And many people ask, why do we do this? Why do we bother? Is it because we're afraid of trichinosis? Is it because God said it and thus we do it and that's enough reason for you? Or is there another reason why this might be a good idea for you? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that right after this bass. And so we have a little break for a musical interlude from our wonderful helpers, Joey Weissenberg and the Hadar Ensemble, who have generously agreed to let us use my favorite song of theirs, the Nola Nigun, or Nola? Nola. They're Nola Nigun for our intro music. And I'm going to take a second here. I'm going to count to 10 to get a little silence sample for our editing purposes later. Okay, so let's jump right back into it. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey. Thank you to the live studio audience who has joined us here today for this session of the Jew Curious Show. And most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to this podcast. I am overjoyed that we get to learn together today on a topic that sometimes makes people gloss over a little bit. These are the Jewish dietary laws that we're going to talk about. They come from the weekly Torah portion, Parashat Shemini, which is roughly Leviticus chapter 9 through 11. But chapter 11 goes over a list of animals that you can eat and a list of animals that you cannot eat if eating animals is your thing. And so we'll go over the different animals that you can eat, the different animals you can't eat. Again, this isn't for everybody. This is a special diet decreed for Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people. However, other people have adopted this diet as well. I am coming to you from sunny Southern California, the land of difficult diets, if I can say. There's the paleo crowd. There's the keto crowd. Sometimes I am among them. There is Atkins, low carb, high carb, low fat, high fat, any diet you can think of. But there is this special diet plan going back to the books of Exodus and Leviticus and in Deuteronomy to some extent, plus the commentaries of the rabbis over the centuries, and that is called kashrut. Meaning, kashrut meaning, for people who keep kosher, if you've heard of that before. So we're going to get into that in just a minute. First, I want to say that if this is your first time listening to this show, welcome, Hero. I'm really glad to have you. I want to make a little bit of a recommendation, and that is to subscribe to this podcast. All you have to do is tap a little button, and then for you, delivered as if by a magical electronic butler, all future episodes of this podcast will be automatically downloaded into your podcast listening device, and you will have complete access to the 30-plus shows that we've done already. So it's one tap and then a lot of work done for you, and then we can stay connected and keep learning together if that's what you desire. And before we go any further, I want to give a special acknowledgement to all the heroes who have joined us for this live studio recording. Who is here today? We've got Kathy from Southern California. We've got Abigail Truman is coming in from the Netherlands. Welcome, Abigail. High five to the Dutch folks. We've got Miriam from New Hampshire. Edith is here from New York. William from Waukee Springs, Florida. We are East Coast, West Coast, and international, y'all. Hey, Josh, it's great to hear you coming in from Alaska. I'm going to pause. I'm going to talk to my friend Josh here for a second. Josh, if you could do me a favor and type in where you are from in Alaska, because my oldest son is about to move to Alaska, and if you're anywhere close to Anchorage, it might be good to introduce you to. So, very glad to hear people coming in from Alaska. We've got at least 5 or 6 time zones covered here. So this is just a conversation I had with my son this week. He's getting married in May coming up, and then the next day, his now fiance, then wife, is driving to Alaska, and he's a school teacher in San Francisco. Can't join her right away because he's got to finish out the school year. But she's driving up to Alaska to take a job, and then he is following her in June. And my oldest and my future daughter-in-law will be living in Alaska. This amuses me because neither of them have ever been to Alaska, but they figure, look, we're young. If there's ever a time to move to Alaska, this is it. And then that gives me a great excuse to go up to Alaska. I've never been there before, but I've heard good things. We see our friend Carla is here, also from SoCal. And so Josh is coming in from Anchorage. So I'm going to hook you up with my son. God willing, you guys can hang out. I don't know if you're into powerlifting. But he is. So if you ever need a powerlifting coach, I could hook you up with another carrier person for that. So thank you for coming in. Let's see. Let's go ahead and do a podcast. Again, I've got a little bit of the sniffles and the chuckles this morning. I've got a frog in my throat, as they say, which, as we will find out in just a moment, is not kosher. But let's do this anyway. So, going to say a quick blessing because we're going to be studying Torah this morning, and whenever we study Torah, it's a good idea to bless God who gives us these mitzvot, these commandments, these good deeds to improve our lives, to elevate our lives, including the mitzvah of studying Torah. And it goes a little something like this, and if you're listening at home, please feel free to say Amen if you agree with that blessing, or just type Amen in the chat if you are here in the live studio audience. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We bless God who is the sovereign of our lives, who elevates our lives with mitzvot, including the mitzvah of engaging in Torah study together. And we have Ruthie is coming in here from SoCal. We got a lot of SoCal people, a couple of Florida people, some East Coast, West Coast, Alaskan coast. I don't know if Anchorage is close to the coast. The whole place seems pretty icy to me, but I haven't been there before. So thank you for being here. Let's jump into it. Today we were talking about Parashat Shemini. This is Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, roughly chapters 9 through 11. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on in this parsha. First, we have, let's say, the consecration of this new place of worship that we have built at God's instruction. We have the Mishkan, this portable sanctuary that we built for God to dwell among us while we are journeying through the wilderness. And once you have the place for this kind of worship, you need some people to run it. And God has selected the Kohanim, this particular group from the tribe of Levi, consisting of Aharon, or Aaron, and his sons. And in last week's Parsha, we talked about their ordination, or the ceremony that they went through for public recognition of their office and responsibility. And now that we've got the place, we've got the people, let us seal the deal, let us consecrate this holy place, and get started with this new way of connecting with God. And immediately, it goes south. I'll say, right in the beginning of this holy service, a couple of Aharon's sons, Nadav and Avihu, make a mistake. right? They're supposed to bring incense. It says they bring their fire pans and they bring their incense, but they bring what's called an ish zerah, or a foreign or alien fire, something out of the ordinary, something off the menu, let's say. There are many discussions in the Midrash about what it means that they brought this strange fire and then they died, right? It says this fire came out and consumed them because they made a mistake. And there are debates about why they deserve this. I mean, this is occupational hazard 101. First day of work, 2 people die on the job. And it always kind of pulls at my heart a little bit because these are Aaron's 2 oldest sons, and my 2 oldest children of my several children are sons. And every time I read this, it kind of pulls at me a little bit because Aharon starts this holy work, and the first thing that happens is he loses 2 children at once. And I can't imagine what that might be like to go through. I know there are people who might be listening to this who have endured that, and my heart goes out because this is unimaginably horrible to me. But it happens, and the rabbis take pains to discuss why it happens. And so we talked about that in the Jew Curious School this week. If you're curious about that, I highly encourage you to give the Jew Curious School a try. There are links to that in this YouTube video. If you're listening to the podcast, you can find this if you go to jewcurious.school/info. Give it a try. There is a 30-day guarantee. If it's not for you, let me know, and you will be made whole. And I totally understand. No questions, no hassles, no judgments. But if you want to give it a try, there's a really nice community of people in there. And this week we learned about the different reasons the rabbis of our tradition shared for why this might have happened to Nadav and Avihu. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. Today we're going to talk about the third thing that's in this parsha. We have the consecration, we have the death of Nadav and Avihu, and then in chapter 11, we talk about kashrut. We talk about the Jewish dietary laws. And chapter 11 is just sort of, it's almost like a menu. It reads like a menu or a health department code or something like that. It says, okay, Bnei Yisrael, that means the descendants of Jacob, or those who inherit the tradition of struggling with God, is another interpretation of Bnei Yisrael. Here's what is fit for you, and here is what is not fit for you. And I want to clarify this. This means fit for you. It doesn't mean that, okay, these animals are no good for anybody. It means that, okay, we have this special relationship, God and the Jewish people. We've got a special project. We've got a special mission. Our God isn't just our God. It's the God for everybody. But we're like a special team. I think of us as like the Holy Delta Force. Maybe that's a bit of a stretch, and maybe that's a little bit macho for some people to learn from. But God is God for everybody. We have a special relationship with God that doesn't judge anybody else's relationship with God. But we've got special rules. Hey, it's a club. We got jackets, right? We've got theme songs. We've got practices that distinguish us to help bind us together, not necessarily to push other people away. But one of those things that binds us together is this commitment that, okay, if you are going to eat meat, and look, it's not a given. In the Garden of Eden, they created people, God created people, God created animals, and then God said, all these grasses and fruits and things like that, that's for you to eat. You and the animals can eat the grasses and the fruits and things like that. So conceivably, lions were vegetarians back then. There is no mention of animals eating meat until 10 generations into our story with Noah. And after Noah gets off the boat, God says, okay, you can sacrifice these animals and you can eat them if you like. And from that point, we see that, it's possible that people were eating meat before then. But at that point, God said, okay, if you're going to eat meat, there are rules, right? Don't take a bite out of a living animal. God forbid. We discussed that a little bit this week in the YouTube Lives, the Noahide laws. Don't eat from an animal that's still alive, whether that's, eating an animal while it's alive, taking a bite out of it. That sounds terribly cruel. Or let's say amputating a chicken leg and, having your chicken hop around on one leg while you eat a chicken leg. It's a great way to keep meat fresh if you don't have a refrigerator, which they did not. In any case, don't do that. It's cruel. right? You shouldn't eat blood. You shouldn't spill the blood of other people, and you shouldn't eat blood of animals. So we have these dietary laws already in Parashat Noach. Perhaps God, understanding that, like, look, I said you can have all the grasses, I said you could have all the fruits. Somehow people are killing animals to eat, and it's really hard to stop them from doing that. So if you're going to do that, there are rules, right? You have to respect the life of all creatures. You don't eat blood. You don't do it in a cruel way. You don't eat animals that are still alive. So if you're going to eat meat, we are going to set up some ground rules for that to instill in you a respect for all life. And these are for everybody. These are the Noahide laws, not necessarily strictly for the Jewish people. But now that we have a Jewish people here in the book of Leviticus, we've been taken out of Egypt, we've been taken out of slavery. There is a nation at this point. First, the covenant was with a family, and now we've reproduced, and the covenant is with a nation. And we were beginning holy worship in the Mishkan, and we're going to bring animals for sacrifice, and the priests are going to eat some of that, and we're going to eat some of that. And so if you are going to eat meat, there has to be some distinctions that you are able to make. And it gives us a list of animals that you can eat. And I'm just going to jump over to my text. I don't have this memorized. I don't know if you think rabbis have the whole Torah memorized. Some do. I do not. But I'll say that let's jump into, I use this great tool called Sefaria, which has a lot of Jewish text available to you online, which I highly recommend. I get no money from the Sefaria people, but nevertheless, it's a great tool because it's a growing library of Jewish text, Torah, Tanakh, Midrash, Talmud, Mishnah, commentary, law codes. Everything you might want to study about Jewish stuff is in Sefaria.org. So I'm going to take a look at Sefaria.org. We're in Leviticus chapter 11 from the very beginning. God speaks to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, "Speak to the Israelite people, Bnei Israel, these are the creatures you may eat from among the land animals. Any animal that has true hooves, with clefts through the hooves, and that's a split hoof, that chews its cud, that's what you can eat." Now, at this point in our story, our people are herdsmen or herdspeople, right? We are ranchers. We raise livestock. And especially if you're traveling through the wilderness, there's not a lot of time to stop and farm, but you can drive your cattle along with you. And so you can eat from your flocks and herds and whatnot. And so many things that we keep have these features of having a split hoof, like a cow or a sheep or a goat, and they are ruminants. They chew their cud. That's part of their digestive process. And I won't get into the details of that because, you know, you might be breaking for lunch right now and might not want to hear exactly what rumination involves. But in any case, these are the kinds of animals we can eat, split hoof, and they are ruminants. They chew their cud. The following, however, of those that either chew the cud or have true hooves, but not both, you shouldn't eat. The camel. Although it chews its cud, it has no true hoofs. You know, the little camel toes. Sorry, I'm going to take that back. They don't. So the camels, they chew their. So although the camel chews its cud, it has no true hooves. It is inappropriate for you. The daman. There's this animal they call the daman. I think that's a translation. In the Hebrew, it's shafan. It says ve'et hashafan. Kimile gera. It chews its cud, but it doesn't have hooves. It's unclean for you. So what is a daman? I think the daman, the species as we call it today, is called the hyrax. The hyrax, some translations of the Torah call it a rock badger, but the hyrax is what you might see if you look it up on Wikipedia or in your handy-dandy Encyclopedia Britannica. The hyrax is a small mammal that lives in the Negev, lives in desert parts of the Middle East. It's an interesting animal to me because it looks a little bit like a rabbit with no ears or a rabbit with short ears, and scientists have determined that its closest genetic relative is the elephant. So if you can imagine an elephant that had a cousin that was a rabbit with short ears, that's what the hyrax is. But here it says it chews its cud, but it doesn't have hooves, right? It's got little claws. Likewise, the rabbit itself, although it chews its cud. Now I know that a rabbit isn't a ruminant; it just kind of chews on stuff a lot, but it's observing that it looks like it chews, but it doesn't. It has rabbit feet. Those are very lucky, I've heard. So you can't eat it. And the swine, right? Any like a pig animal, right? You can't eat that. It has hooves, like the hooves that we're talking about, but it doesn't chew its cud, so you don't eat it. This is why, to many people's great regret, bacon is not on the menu if you're keeping the Jewish dietary laws. It says you can't eat them, you can't touch the meat, you can't you can't touch their carcasses, things like that. And I just raised that. I mean, this is getting kind of morbid, but I raise that because often I get the question, because it says right here, you can't eat pigs, and you can't even touch pig meat, and you can't even touch their carcasses. So people ask me, is it okay for Jews to play football? Because traditionally, I don't know if this is still the case or if they have different methods of deriving the skin for footballs, but people at least used to call it a pigskin. They were made out of pigskin. So can Jewish people play football? Meaning, can they touch a ball that's made out of cured, tanned hide of swine? And the answer is yes, in the sense that the difference between, let's say, an animal when it's passed away, you shouldn't be touching the animal carcass if it's not an animal that's appropriate for you. But once it's been skinned, that skin has been processed and tanned and treated and all that stuff to the point that it is leather, then the rabbis consider this so far removed from its original source. It's like a davar hadash. You can touch that and use that for certain things. Same with leather jackets. Some people might ask, can I wear a leather jacket that's made out of a cow that wasn't necessarily harvested in a kosher way? And yes, again, it's so far removed from its original source that you don't have to worry about that stuff. So I've got some vegans out there right now who are cringing at me even talking about this, but I do have a point, and bear with me. So we have these rules, and I'm not going to go through all of them. There are other things. It talks about certain kinds of fish you should or should not eat. Pretty much if you're talking about seafood, we're talking about the fish that looks like a fish, right? The fish that's okay to eat is fish with fins and scales. And if it doesn't have fins or scales, don't eat it. And this would rule things out like pretty much any shellfish, right? Don't be shellfish and don't eat shellfish. You can't have, clams, mussels, oysters, stuff like that. Lobsters and shrimps and crawdaddies, as we used to say in Texas, or crayfish. You don't eat that stuff. They kind of look like bugs to me anyway, so I don't miss them that much. But you can have a fish that has fins and scales. And this puts a lot of your, typical sushi fish, let's say, like tuna and salmon and halibut and carp and all these things that are fish-shaped fish, right? They have fins, they have scales, they are just fine to eat if you are a fish-eating person. Leaves out, and this is something I do miss, catfish. I grew up in like the Gulf Coast, Texas area, and catfish was a popular dish back then. Probably still is, but you can't eat catfish because catfish has fins but no scales. It also leaves out sharks, and some people give different reasons for kashrut. Some people say, "Oh, it's because God said it. I don't, I'm going to listen to what God said." But I think not eating sharks is just good safety advice. I don't know if you've ever tried to catch a shark, but that sounds terribly dangerous to me. So we don't eat catfish, we don't eat sharks, we don't eat eels, we don't eat things like that. And there are certain kinds of birds that we eat or don't eat. But instead of getting into the details of these different species and things like that, I want to talk about why one might do this, why one might bother with this, because it can be a significant inconvenience. I'm not going to lie to you. When you are choosing to eat kosher meat versus meat that's not kosher, and there are other rules to it as well. It's not just the type of species that you can eat, but also it's important as to how that species is harvested, which is my sort of euphemism for being shechted or slaughtered, how it is taken out of the living world and processed in order for us to eat it. So it has to be the right species. It has to be killed the right way. It has to not mix with other things. It has to not mix with milk, let's say. But there are lots of rules. The rabbis call kashrut, or the practice of keeping kosher, a mountain hanging from a thread. And what that means is we have this whole body of law, all these rules, a big, expansive do's and don'ts of this diet that come from very concise verses of Torah, in the sense that it just says to us 3 times in the Torah, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. And from that, we derive all sorts of things like not just no cheeseburgers, but having separate sets of dishes, waiting a period of time between eating meat and milk, all sorts of things from very few verses in the Torah. So it can be a chore. And, if you haven't grown up this way, especially, I think if you grow up keeping this and your family keeps it, you just sort of absorb it and it becomes natural and second nature to you. But if, like me, you're coming to this as an adult, it can seem overwhelming. And people ask, why bother, right? And not just people who are converting, but there are Jews who say, why bother? There is this conjecture that the reason it was instituted was because of hygiene and food safety standards or practices that were available to people at the time. And they said, for example, we don't eat pigs because back in the day, there were no refrigerators and trichinosis might have been a problem. Now, trichinosis, my understanding is that this is a particular parasite, the trichina worm or trichina. I don't know how you say that. I'm not a parasite expert. But this particular parasite that is most found in pork and can be contracted if you eat undercooked pork or unrefrigerated pork. And so people decided, they must have ruled out pigs because they saw people getting sick from eating pigs. And so that's why that this rule was instituted. However, today we have refrigerators and we have food safety standards and things like that. So if it's no longer unsafe, then that original reason for keeping kosher no longer pertains. And the fact is, let me rephrase that. And so my take on this is that this is, let's say, an excuse, right? There's nothing scientifically stated in the Torah about why we should do this. There's almost nothing that says why we should do this in the first place. We get these practices as saying, okay, God says we have this relationship. There are ground rules to this relationship. It started off with Avram. You're going to be my Avram. I'm going to be your God. I took you out of Egypt to future generations. God said, I took you out of Egypt. And so you're going to be my people. I'm going to be your God. We're going to hang. Here's 10 commandments for you. And then here's 603 more in the rest of the Torah. And one of the rules is there are certain animals you can eat. If you're going to eat animals, there are certain animals you should not eat. And if you're going to eat these animals that you can eat, there's a certain way they need to be processed in a way that minimizes the cruelty of their harvesting. And so these are often considered what's called a chok, right? There are mishpatim and there are chukim. Mishpatim are rules that we get that we might have figured out anyway. Right? It's just logical things. Don't murder people. Great idea if you're going to have a stable society. Don't kidnap. Don't steal. Don't be cruel. Don't oppress people. Don't stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. Those are logical things, and these are known as sort of mishpatim, because at some point, God says, keep my mishpatim and my chukim. So mishpatim we get. Chukim are a little bit more difficult to understand. And so the rabbis said, okay, it says hukim. What is hukim? And they figured, okay, hukim are those rules that we get that maybe we don't quite understand why they're there yet. Don't mix wool and linen fibers. Don't eat camels, right? They said there's lots of camels around here. Why not eat camels? Just don't eat camels. And sometimes it feels a little bit like, I don't know if you've ever heard this from a parent or heard this from yourself talking to your own children, because I'm your mother and I said so, or because I'm your father and I said so. Just like, don't ask me questions, just do what I say. And maybe I'll tell you later, or maybe when you're a parent, you'll understand. And these are often very unsatisfying when you hear these kinds of rules. And then later on, you figure out that maybe it wasn't such a bad idea. And so for many people, kashrut falls into this category of because I'm your father, because I'm your mother, and I said so, and that's how we're going to do it. For many people, these rules are tribal, right? People like us, to quote the author Seth Godin, people like us do things like this. Like this distinguishes who we are. This is how we identify one another. This is how our community binds together, is we have these customs. They may be rational, they may not be rational, but this is how we distinguish one another from other communities. This is how we know who we're in a tribe with. And these are practices that other people want to take on when they join our tribe so that we could be one people. And I have, I'll say, another idea. And I didn't make this up. I got this from my teachers going back years, decades, and even centuries into the sages of our tradition. My take on this is that this is a gift from God teaching us to make distinctions. And if you've read my book, The Promised Life, I talk a little bit about this in the chapter on the gift of distinction. This is a spiritual discipline that helps elevate us. This is a practice that we take on, making decisions in the most small and mundane areas of our life. That is the consumption of food, something that we share with every single life form on this planet, and probably other planets as well, if there are life forms on other planets. I think the math is in their favor. Every creature eats. Every creature metabolizes substances from their environment in order to generate energy in order to survive. Right? This is the most basic animal instinct we have, but it goes beyond animals. It's the most basic thing that we do, that we share with all life forms. You do not get more mundane than that. And what I believe is that by taking on practices of spiritual discipline that allow us to be mindful in the moment that we were making the most mundane decisions that we have to make, that strengthens us to make more difficult decisions, right? If I take this thing that I do all day, every day, if I take this thing that I do every single day, 3 times at a minimum, and some between meal snacks as well, I'm not going to lie to you. If I can use that as an occasion to say, this is appropriate for me, this is not appropriate for me, then if I am faced with a, let's say, more daunting, more impactful, higher stakes moral choice later in that day or in another day, I've already built the muscle to say, this is appropriate, this is not appropriate. We bless God all the time, but especially for Havdalah, that moment where we're acknowledging the end of Shabbat. Havdalah means distinguishing. And so we do it in that moment to distinguish between Shabbat, a holy day, and the other days of the week. Now, the other days of a week are really important to us. Those are the days that we work. Those are the days that we generate resources to sustain us, to sustain our families, to sustain our communities. So there's nothing wrong with the mundane. There's nothing wrong with the weekday. But in that moment between Shabbat and the weekday, we bless God for teaching us how to decide between right and wrong, how to decide between holy and mundane, how to decide between what's good for us and what's bad for us. And then we exercise that every time we take a bite of something. And so while these rules in Leviticus, and there's also some rules in Exodus and Deuteronomy as well, while these rules may seem arbitrary, they are for us to take advantage of, to build the muscle of distinction in our lives. We make moral decisions in small ways to strengthen us to make moral distinctions in big ways. Somebody offers us a business deal that might be in kind of a gray area. We can say, if you have never made a moral decision all that day or before that, you say, what's the harm? Right? Some people say it's good, some people say it's bad, but I'm just going to take advantage of this situation and that'll be fine. And sometimes it is and sometimes it's not. right? If we have decisions to make in a relationship, whether we are going to be faithful to a partner or not, what's the harm if nobody knows, right? If we have a decision to make standing up for ourselves in a situation of injustice or unfairness. My thesis here, heroes, is that if you practice making distinctions all day long in small ways, you will be stronger for those moments when you have to make decisions that have a much more, let's say, immediate impact or long-term impact on your physical health, moral health, relational health, etc. So that's what I wanted to teach today. That's what I learned from Parshat Shemini is this list of seemingly arbitrary animals that we can eat or can't eat, especially in this day where there's no sort of scientific justification for this. We still have this gift of exercising spiritual, mental, moral, gastronomic discipline every single day that I firmly believe makes us stronger people. So with that, I want to go into our chat to see what's going on. I love the chat of the live studio audience because people, a lot of times people are asking questions. A lot of times people are just shouting out and high-fiving each other, which is great to hear. So imagine we have a lot of questions about this. We've been going for about 40 minutes now. So let's see. Miriam is here saying hi to Kay and Abby. Edith is here. William is here from Florida. Talked to Josh from Alaska. All right. Dave says, I just jumped into the chat. Can you address the troubling account of the death of Aharon's sons? So I'll say we're not going to do that today. We did that in the Jew Curious School this week, and I mostly wanted to focus on kashrut today. It is a terribly troubling account. I will mention a couple of the ideas that people had. One, the rabbis say, look, this is Eish Zerah, this is foreign fire. They wanted to make it clear right from the outset that this is serious work. And if on the first day of work, these young men are bringing something that's, off the menu, God is setting an example. And that's really troubling on a lot of levels. But another account that people have is that right after this episode, God speaks to Aharon. God speaks not to Moses, but directly to Aaron and says, okay, here's a rule for the priests. Do not come to work intoxicated. Right? Don't come to work drunk. It doesn't say you can't drink wine. We drink wine at festivals all the time, but it says don't come intoxicated. And because of the connection of these two things, this horrible thing that happens to Aaron's sons, and then the immediate following instructions, wish maybe we'd gotten this ahead of time, do not come to priestly work impaired. Some people have deduced that Nadav and Avihu, first day of work, maybe, they were excited, maybe they were nervous, maybe they were celebrating the night before. They came to work intoxicated, and that's why they made the mistake that they did. And so that is that's a smichut parshot. That's a connection that people draw because of the proximity of these two things. So that's a couple of different takes on Nadav and Avihu. There are actually many more in the Midrash available on that. So we're talking a lot about visiting Alaska. So glad I brought that up. William shares, whatever Hashem forbids us in the Torah, is there something similar that is permissible? For example, though we are forbidden to eat pork, is it permissible to eat a fish that tastes like pork? So I love this kind of yin-yang, this balance in the universe that you're talking about. There are things that are forbidden, and there are things that are permitted. And there's a story about a rabbi who says, God will judge me in the world to come, not for the forbidden pleasures that I took advantage of, because I guess this guy was a pretty kosher dude. He says, God will judge me for the permissible pleasures that I did not take advantage of. Right? There's lots of things that are still on the menu, and we consider all of these things a gift from God to ennoble, to enhance, to bring more joy to our lives. And God wants us to be happy. People might have a difference of opinion on that, but I firmly believe God wants us to be happy and created a world that we can be happy in. And so there's this tradition we have that we will be judged not necessarily only for our failures or our mistakes or our bad deeds. We will be judged for the good things in life that we didn't take time to appreciate. And so if your question is, what if you eat a fish that's not pork, right? Fish, it's hard for imagine like a pork fish, but I just wanted to say the word pork fish because that sounds funny to me. But if you have a fish that tastes kind of like pork, but it's a fish and it's got fins and scales, it's fine. One thing I was surprised when I was studying in Israel and living in Israel for a little while is that if you go to some place like a Subway sandwich shop, and I know it wasn't Subway, but it was like a local franchise, something we don't have in America in the cold cuts aisle is goose. They had goose that you could put on a sandwich, and this was apparently popular and readily available. Goose is kind of a precious thing here in the U.S., but every sub shop had goose, and I wondered why, and so I ordered goose. Yeah, and I'm going to tell you exactly what it tastes like. It tastes a little bit like ham. So I admit I have tasted ham in my life. It's been quite a long time, but maybe that's why goose is so popular, because it is a permissible bird that tastes a little bit like ham. So there's that. There are alternatives. If bacon's off the menu for you now, there's something they sell called beef fry, which is very much like bacon that's made out of beef, and you can substitute it in recipes and things like that, as long as you're not mixing it with dairy. So Miriam shares, camels have bad breath. Probably another good reason not to eat camels. There's lots of animals that have bad breath, and some people too sometimes. I'm not going to judge, but you should floss. Let's see. Kathy shares, pigs are basically nature's garbage units. It's true as well. Someone shares, camel milk has such a weird taste. I'm going to take your word for that. So I'm not going to have camel milk anytime soon. Vanessa asks, what about the animals they did not know about? And I think this is a great question. And this goes to some of the animals they sort of name by name, right? They say no ospreys or vultures or rock badgers and things like that. But they also give us general categories, right? And this allows us to make distinctions in new situations, right? They just said from the outset, the general rule, eat things with split hooves that chew their cud. And then the examples they give are to clarify the generalities. Like a camel chews its cud, doesn't have a split hoof. So for example, don't eat camels. Don't eat rabbits. They seem to chew their cud, don't have hooves. Don't eat pigs. Not, just because we're singling out the pig, right? Not because somebody has a beef against a pig, if I can say that. But a pig is an example of an animal that has the split hoof, but doesn't chew its cud. So if it satisfies both of those criteria, even if it's like a New World animal or an animal they hadn't discovered yet, if it has those features, then you can eat it. If it doesn't have both of those features, you can't. Same with fish. It doesn't give species of fish. It says something that lives in the water that has fins and scales, you can eat it. Everything else, you can't. It gives a general prohibition on creepy crawlies. So I know that there are probably millions of species of insects that we haven't discovered yet. And yet, generally speaking, we don't eat insects. And so that it gives us general rules that we can derive specifics from when we encounter a new kind of species. For example, it is much more specific about birds, and it lists out different species of birds. And this is one of my favorite sections because it says like 8 different kinds of owls. And that's humorous to me that it says the great owl, the small owl, the medium-sized owl, the blue owl, the black owl, the purple owl. It just goes through all these different kinds of owls. But from those specifics, there is drawing specifics from generalities, but there's also drawing generalities from specifics. And so from all these specific birds that it says, we can draw the generality that we don't eat birds of prey. We don't eat birds that are scavengers or that eat carrion, like vultures and things like that. So we don't eat scavengers. We don't eat predators. Let's say top-level predators that derive most of their diet from eating other birds or other animals. Sometimes people ask about chickens. Chickens are a kosher animal, but if you've raised chickens or if you know chickens, sometimes they eat, mostly they eat feed and grain and things like that, but sometimes they'll pick up little bugs and things and they'll eat animals. So they say, well, isn't that a predatory act? But chickens and turkeys and things like that are not primarily birds of prey. And so we can take the general to derive this. We could take the general to derive the specific. In Jewish law, this is called klal uprat. In Jewish law, this is called klal ufrat, or going from the general to the specific. But there's also prat uklal. There's also going from the specific to the general. And so that will help us out when we discover maybe new species on other planets. One of my dreams is to be the first rabbi on Mars. My family, when I mention this, always says bon voyage. Nobody wants to go to Mars with me, but if anybody here wants to go to Mars with me, we'll see what kind of animals we find. So let's see if we have some other questions. And Abigail says, and now I learned that camel milk is not kosher. So if you can't eat the animal, you can't drink the milk either. Can you make a football out of a camel? Sure. Good luck catching one. I hear they have bad breath. Let's see. Abigail says fishing with dynamite is not kosher, right? You know, I haven't seen anything specifically in the Shulchan Aruch that says fishing with dynamite is not kosher, but you're going to kill a lot of animals besides just the fish that you want to eat. So I'll say I'm going to say that's out of bounds. You know, let's try to make it fair, people. Yeah, and so sometimes people raise the question about hunting. I would say, fish doesn't necessarily have to be shechted in the same way that other animals do. Fish is kind of a strange animal in that it's considered parv. When we have the distinctions between milk and meat, we have fleischig or basari, which is meat. We have milchig or halavi, which are ways of saying this food is dairy, and then we have parv, which is neither and can be served or eaten with either. And fish, kosher fish, falls into the category of parv. It's considered not meat, and so the question comes: do you have to shecht a fish the same way you have to shecht other things? No, but you can cook a fish whole, for example. But I'm going to say, look, don't fish with dynamite. There's also, maybe this isn't kosher. There's a general rule: don't do stuff that's stupid dangerous. You are created in the image of God. Don't take unnecessary risks. Don't take unnecessary risks with your life. And I would throw fishing with dynamite into that category. Besides, you're going to kill a lot of animals that you're not going to eat, and that's just wasteful. That sort of violates bal tashchit. Don't be wasteful with natural resources. So I can't say specifically if it's unkosher to fish with dynamite, but there are plenty of other rules that breaks. Vanessa raises hunting is not kosher because animals need to be killed in a certain way, right? I got this question earlier in the week. Yes, generally speaking, we don't hunt for food in the Jewish civilization. The reason is that when you're hunting, it can be hard to get the harvesting part right. Like if you're pursuing an animal with a firearm or a bow and arrow or spear or something like that, it moves pretty fast, and you might hit it in a way that it doesn't die right away, or that it might suffer. It might die in a way that's other than our process of shechita or slaughter, where particular kind of knife is used with a particular level of sharpness, and the mode of harvesting animals is such that the major arteries, windpipe, and nerve column are severed almost simultaneously. That accomplishes two things. It eliminates suffering of the animal as quickly as possible. It also enables the proper and rapid draining of blood, because we have a prohibition on eating blood. Now, there's always a little bit of blood left in animals, but our goal is to remove as much of the blood as possible. And if you are hunting for an animal, it's nearly impossible to control that perfectly. What if you're starving? What if there's no food around? What if you've been walking through the desert for a month without eating, and there's no food around, but somebody offers you a ham sandwich? Can you eat that ham sandwich? Not only can you, but you must, right? Preserving human life is of primary importance in Jewish law, and to preserve human life, you can violate almost any provision of the Torah whatsoever. There's a couple of exceptions to that, but you can't perform sexual violence or idolatry in order to save your life, but outside of or desecrate God in some way. But for keeping kosher, for keeping Shabbat, for making sure you're praying on time and things like that, if you need to save your life, eat the sandwich. If you need to hunt in order to literally feed your family and there's no other alternatives, good luck with the hunt. But generally speaking, in a settled civilization where we have access to farm raised or personally raised animals to consume, and there's no need to hunt, we don't hunt as a recreational activity, only out of necessity and really absolute life-saving necessity, and that's why. So let's see. Let's see what other questions we have today. This is a really important point that I'm glad. Somebody I said that, and then the chat kind of gets away from me for a little bit. But somebody was raising a point about the expense of kashrut, and I want to touch on that for a second. So I'm just looking at this in the chat. Stop chatting, people, so I can find it. Okay, here we go. Abigail raises a really valid point that I know a lot of people face when making this decision to eat kosher food. And she says, kosher food is super expensive, double priced, meat especially. And I hear so many Jews just skipping pig and cheese with meat. Or maybe if I misunderstand. And I hear so many Jews just skipping let's say, forbidden animals and mixing meat and milk, but don't necessarily buy kosher food, but don't necessarily buy meat that is certified as kosher because it's so expensive. And it frightens me to keep kosher as a convert because I don't have the resources. And this is a real thing. I'm not going to lie to you. And there's a reason that kosher meat is so expensive, because it has to be raised, because it has to be raised in a certain way, harvested in a certain way. There are many people supervising the process. There's a different kind of slaughter that is used by these factory meat production plants. And so because there are more people involved, because there are more steps involved, because there's supervision involved, each of those has a little bit of tax along the way. And that's why kosher meat is often double the price of comparable meat that's not labeled kosher. It might be from a kosher animal, but it hasn't been processed and supervised in that way. So it can be super expensive. And there's a couple things I'll say about that. First off, when you are, because you mentioned this in the context of conversion or somebody who's adopting these laws, don't try to do everything at once. And this is a general principle that I have. Like, yes, if you're Jewish, these mitzvot apply. And somebody said, okay, like if you're not doing everything exactly right from the get-go, that's a sin and you're responsible for that. However, from personal experience and from experience working with my students, these big areas of Jewish practice like Shabbat and kashrut that have lots of rules, that have lots of, we'll say, regional variation and community customs and things like that. There's so many things to do that I really caution people not to try to do everything at once, right? If you try to be perfect about Shabbat on your first Shabbat, you will get overwhelmed. You will get freaked out. You will feel like a failure for the mistakes that you make because you're just learning how to do it. And for many people, this overwhelm then discourages them from trying again. And this is true about Shabbat. This is true about keeping kosher. And so in both of those circumstances, but now we'll talk about keeping kosher, start small, right? If you have a diet that is full of, cheeseburgers and shrimps and ham and things like that, don't try to get don't just go through your cabinets and clear everything out and kosher everything and try to be perfect from day one. Start small, right? Maybe you make the decision, from now on, I'm not going to eat shellfish. I'm not going to make any of the changes, but I'm just not going to eat shellfish. And you see how that goes if shellfish is an important part of your diet. And then one day you say, you know what, I'm going to stop eating ham, right? It doesn't cost anything to stop eating ham, right? You say, so here's one thing that's off the menu. Here's another thing that's off the menu. And then down the road, once you are accustomed to this, applying this kind of mindfulness and discipline to your diet, you say, I'm going to stop mixing meat and milk together. It says it like 3 times in the Torah. Pretty clear about that. So I'm just going to stop doing that. I'm going to go from cheeseburgers to hamburgers, and I'll eat some cheese later, maybe. And so start small, work your way into it. And then you might say, so I'm only going to eat animals that are on this list that we've been talking about in Leviticus chapter 11. And then from there, you may decide someday, okay, from now on, I'm only going to eat those animals, and I'm only going to eat them if they have been processed in a certain way. And yes, there is an upgrade to expense at that point. However, I want to go back to this original idea of when we were in Gan Eden, when we were in the Garden of Eden, nobody ate meat, period. At least, according to our traditional read of this. Nobody was eating meat. Lions weren't eating meat. And that sounds a little bit unscientific, but go with me on this one. At one point, it became clear to God that we were going to eat meat. And so God said, okay, you're going to eat meat. Here are some rules. My answer to the question, my answer to the assertion that I'm not going to eat kosher meat because it's more expensive is to say that I'm not going to curb my consumption of meat one bit. And maybe the decision you make, if it's meaningful for you to take on this only eating kosher meat, is, okay, if it's double the price, maybe I'm going to eat half as much meat from now on. And my meat budget stays the same. I'm just eating half as much meat. And there are plenty of people out there, not just scholars of kashrut, but scholars of food science and the impact that raising meat has on our environment and things like that, that say maybe that's not such a terrible idea to eat less meat. And maybe my way into eating less meat is by only eating specific kinds of meat that have been handled in a specific way. And so I'm, let's say, again, to get into the meat eating example, 2 birds with 1 stone, right? I'm accomplishing this upgrade to my spiritual discipline. B, I am consuming less animal products. I am taking fewer lives with my diet. I am contributing less to the environmental cost of raising meat, at least in the United States and around the world as well. And so that might be a way into it. I'm not going to argue with you. Kosher meat is expensive, right? And if you have a family that's really depends on, heavily on meat consumption to get through the week, it's tough to raise a family. It's tough to get everybody fed. It's tough to satisfy different people's desires and nutritional needs. I'm going to suggest that it is possible to eat less meat and have that meat be more according to your spiritual plan. And so that's it's not a perfect solution, but I know that in keeping kosher, my family eats a lot less meat now than we used to. We eat less variety of meat because we're not eating certain things anymore, and we still eat probably a fair amount of meat. I'm not going to lie to you, I do love to grill. However, I'll say on the whole, we probably eat less meat now than we used to before the family kept kosher. So I hope that's helpful for you. Some people might not be satisfied with that answer, but like I said, 2 birds with 1 stone. You can elevate the mindfulness of your diet. You can also consume less meat, take fewer lives in your diet, and I think that's a good thing either way. Let's see. Josh shares there's chips made from crickets and other insects now. Saw those in a local grocery store, and it blew my mind. Yes, I've heard this all. I do spend a fair amount of time on the internet, so I have heard about the popularity of cricket protein, cricket powder, cricket energy bars, and things like that. So if you need an excuse, if you need a note from your rabbi, if you need a reason not to eat crickets, let's just take a look at Leviticus. So for many people around the world, that's insects are a staple of their diet. I'm going to trust them on that. I'm going to take their word for it, and I'm going to stay away from crickets. Mary Mass, in the conservative movement, should you keep separate pots and pans for meat and dairy? What if you don't drink or use milk? So yes, by the party line in the conservative movement, we keep kosher just like everybody else. which means some of us don't and some of us do. But if you are going to keep kosher, we follow the same laws of the Shulchan Aruch and the Talmud and elsewhere that says we like to keep separate pots and pans, cooking items, cooking devices for meat and milk. Some people have double sinks. Some people have double refrigerators and double stoves and all that stuff. That is a stringency and extraneous, in my opinion, because there's ways to keep kosher without those things. Don't feel like you have to remodel your kitchen in order to keep kosher. But you can keep separate pots and pans, and you can buy sets of pots and pans pretty reasonably these days. So, storage becomes an issue sometimes, but we like to keep those separate because the consideration is the things that we cook with are often porous, and a pot that we cook meat in may absorb some of the flavor from the meat, even if it's minuscule and almost undetectable. It will absorb some of the essence or flavor of that meat. And so when you cook milk in it, those flavors will mix, and that's why we keep separate pots and pans. But to Miriam's second question, what if you don't drink or use milk? Well, then it becomes a lot easier, right? In the sense that if you never have dairy touching your pots and pans, then you can have one set of pots and pans just for meat, right? Because if there's literally no chance of having dairy mix with the meat pots and pans, then you don't need two sets of pots and pans. And we'll go back to another thing I was saying earlier. If you're vegetarian, this gets way easier, right? If you let's say you're lacto-ovo vegetarian, meaning you're vegetarian, you don't eat animals, like identifiable animals, but you have animal products like eggs and milk. Again, this is a lot simpler because if you're never cooking meat, then there's no chance of meat and milk mixing in your cooking devices, right? There's just milk. And eggs, again, we're talking about the category of fish being neither meat nor milk. Eggs are considered parv. Eggs are considered neither meat nor milk, so you can eat them with anything. So if you are only eating meat and no dairy products, then you don't need two separate sets of dishes or two separate sets of pots and pans. If you are only eating milk and no meat, same thing. If you are vegan, as many of my students are, this gets super simple, right? Because there's no chance that either meat or milk or any animal product are going to mingle with one another. And so a vegan diet, strictly kept, is by its nature a kosher diet. Now, there are some fine distinctions that we make about certain kinds of produce of certain vintage that we eat, but a lot of the stuff based on vegetables is if you're a farmer in Israel, let's say. But I'll say in the United States of America, if you are keeping a strictly vegan diet, that is a pretty strict form of kashrut already, and you don't need to worry too much. Let's see. Let's see. I'm looking for good questions in here. Vanessa asks, I'm sorry, I'm looking for questions. All the questions here are good. There's somebody here just being here to troll, it appears. I'm not going to worry too much about him. Vanessa says, do canned vegetables or vegetarian soups have to be kosher? And so, many people have different standards as to when they're looking for hechshers on certain devices, meaning many people have different standards when looking for hechshers on processed foods, in the sense that when let's say they're buying what is labeled as vegetable soup. So some people will look for the hechsher, meaning the little symbol that says it's been inspected and it's kosher. Some people just check the list of ingredients. I'll say many times vegetable soup has a kind of a meat stock to it. And so if you're interested in making these fine distinctions, if you're out at a restaurant, so I'll go to restaurants. I don't only necessarily go to strictly kosher supervised restaurants, but when I go to restaurants, I don't eat meat. And if they're making soup, I'll ask, does the soup have a meat stock to it? Because a lot of soups that are not necessarily identifiably meat soups have a chicken stock base or a beef stock base or something like that that's added for flavor. Like cooked beans often are flavored with, cooked beans are often prepared with lard or ham hock or something like that. So you have to ask about it. But let's say if you're buying canned vegetables, if the only thing on the ingredient list is the vegetable, like peas or beets or whatever, I wouldn't worry about it too much. There's some people for any kind of processed or canned food at all, they will check the label just to make sure. that perhaps they're worried perhaps it was canned in equipment that also canned meat stuff or also canned dairy stuff. I follow the opinion of rabbis who say like that equipment is usually cleaned thoroughly between applications, so I don't worry about the equipment necessarily that it was made on, but you do have to check the label sometimes. One fun fact in American labeling laws is that anything that is less than 2% of the total volume of what's in the can doesn't have to be listed on the ingredient list. And the general rule for kashrut, whether we worry about if there's any kind of cross-contamination, is not 1/50th, but 1/60th. And so the standards for not having a meat product in there are stricter than the standards for American labeling laws. Now, if you're buying something that's certified vegan, this is not necessarily the USDA checking it. These are vegan supervising organizations that are very careful to make sure there's zero meat products in there whatsoever. And so generally, if I see something is labeled vegan, I don't worry about it being cross-contaminated. Another fun fact is if you're reading the ingredients to check for kashrut, there's this ingredient often called natural flavorings, which to my understanding is often beef fat. So if you see something, it's like vegetable, natural flavorings, you might want to find a different brand. Look for the vegetarian stuff, look for the vegan stuff, and check that out. So just 1 second. Okay, just doing a little moderation in the chat because there's somebody here causing shenanigans. So, all right. So Josh shares, I attended a vegan Passover once. Instead of the lamb shank, they had a yam shank. I've heard of this before. We often have a shank bone on the Seder plate to symbolize the Paschal lamb or the lamb offering. And a vegetarian friend of mine always has a Paschal yam. So I've heard of this before as well. So let's see what else we have in the chat. Listen, everybody, this has been a great conversation. We've been going for more than an hour. I know I love to talk. I know I love to hear you talking and raising your questions, but we're going to go ahead and wrap this up so we can all prepare for Shabbat if you're not already there. So usually I close off the podcast with some words of gratitude and signing off. After I do that, feel free to hang out. I'll be hanging out for a little bit if anybody has questions for me. So here we go. Listen, everybody, this has been an incredible discussion with the live studio audience, and I also want to thank you, Hero, for listening to this podcast, for learning with us today. If it's your first time here, I highly recommend that you subscribe to this podcast. You'll hear all of our future episodes and get access to all of our past episodes as well. If you would like to participate in a future live studio recording, I encourage you to go to my YouTube page. Just go to YouTube, type in my name, Rabbi John Carrier. There's other John Carriers. There's an economist from MIT. There is a popular soccer coach on YouTube. But type in Rabbi, R-A-B-B-I, John with an H, Carrier with 3 R's. And you'll find me, and you'll see a listing of all future broadcasts. And you can jump in and join us and ask your questions live. And I'd love to have you, Hero. Another way to engage with this community is to join us at the Jew Curious Community Center. This is a private, lovingly tended, carefully guarded, troll-free Facebook group where Jew curious people just like you get together, share their stories, share their questions, support one another. It's been really fantastic to see how this community has grown and developed and really loves on each other. So I highly recommend it. You can find that by going to jewcurious.show/JCC, as in Jew Curious Community Center. One last favor I'd like to ask, if you have enjoyed this show, please let us know. Go to iTunes and leave us a rating and or a review. Just give us the appropriate number of stars as your heart moves you. And I'd love to read a little note. Share with us how this has helped you, if this has helped you. What do you think? What would you like to hear about in the future? And we'd love to... And I'd love to read those reviews just to see if we're on the right track and to give high fives to people who are enjoying this show. As always, I appreciate learning with you. You can't imagine how I appreciate learning with you. And until next time, hero, peace. All right, everybody on the live chat, we made Minyan. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. We did have some shenanigans by somebody preaching a different religion of Zorro, I think. But I learned how to use the hide button in the chat. So most of the time, this is a super friendly chat. Every once in a while, we get some shenanigans. If somebody wants to volunteer to be moderator, I can add that feature to allow other people to chase off the trolls that are just wasting our time. Pretty much, I don't get bothered by it, but sometimes we get people who don't have the purest of intentions or the sincerest of curiosity. So we don't need that. In any case, really enjoyed learning with you all this week here. We've done 5 live sessions of about an hour apiece, and it blows me away that people keep showing up for this. I love teaching, and so this is my favorite thing in the world to do. And just this is valuable for me really warms my heart. Great way to go into Shabbat. Really appreciate how people support each other in the chat, support each other in the community. And that's the icing on the cake for me. So the learning is great, but for me, the community is just really top notch. And so I appreciate that. And so we'll talk more about kashrut. Vanessa's sharing that it's difficult to find kosher foods in Germany. That is absolutely true. I'm not going to argue with you there. In the U.S., it's hard to find labeled, supervised kosher food outside of major metropolitan areas. When I lived in Knoxville, Tennessee, there was some kosher things in the grocery store, mostly like hot dogs and salami, nothing to make a diet out of. And it wasn't because of us. It was because the Seventh-day Adventists had a big presence in town. And they lobbied Kroger. Some of them keep kosher. And they lobbied the local supermarket to have those things. But when we had holidays, people would go to the Jewish Community Center and place a meat order. And the meat would be ordered from Atlanta, probably about a 3-hour drive away, and shipped to Knoxville in dry ice. And then before the holiday, you would go to the Jewish Community Center and pick up your brisket for Passover, for example. So it's hard, but it's not impossible. And especially, anything that's just raw ingredients, like anything in the produce aisle, unprocessed food, dry beans, things, rice, pasta, things like that. Raw ingredients don't need a hechsher to them. It may require a modification if you have a diet that's got a lot of meat in it, but that's not necessarily a bad thing for you. There are plenty of ways you can keep kosher without looking for that supervised label necessarily. And so in the Intro to Judaism class that I teach here in Los Angeles, we always do a scavenger hunt where I take people to the local grocery store and ask them to look for various things. And one of the takeaways is, and this isn't just like look for kosher chicken, kosher meat, kosher this and that, but, I'll say look for a rutabaga and tell me, does it have a symbol on it? Can you eat a rutabaga? If you're eating rutabaga, I don't know who eats rutabaga. Rhubarb, and is good in pies. But, does a rutabaga need a hechsher? And the answer is it does not. And people walk away from that experience saying the grocery store is full of things that are kosher, even if they're not necessarily labeled as kosher. And so if this is a spiritual discipline that you want to take on, if this is a mitzvah that you want to keep, there are ways to do it. And Jews have found ways to do it literally every place in the world. Some places like LA, it's super easy. Some places it's not. But I find those things that are most meaningful in life are those things that we have figured out to do in a hard-won way. So I'm not glossing over how difficult it can be, but I really appreciate that it's possible I really appreciate that it is possible to make this work, whatever situation you're in. I do want to address this before we sign off. I wish I had this in the podcast. I may add it back in. Abby says, I'm just afraid that when I convert modern Orthodox and I don't keep kosher perfectly, my conversion gets nullified. So I can't speak to the converting judiciary bodies out there for all movements. I only know my movement. We really encourage people to keep kosher. We encourage people to try it. And sometimes, if people are trying it out and they're in the process and they're not perfect, we don't stop them from not being perfect. My understanding is that part of the Orthodox conversion process is that people will come to your home and see how you are keeping kosher to decide whether you're keeping kosher by their standards. the idea that someone would nullify a conversion, I'm not going to say that never happens, but I find that to be anathema. I find that that rabbis would have the chutzpah to go back and cancel a conversion, not only to be disgusting, but actually in violation of Jewish law, in the sense that once somebody converts to Judaism, they are considered always Jewish, right? Meaning that if they have, Jewish grandchildren, there's no question, right? There's, as one of my teachers said to me, what do you call a Jewish person who converts to Judaism and then the next day goes to a Catholic church and takes communion? An apostate Jew, right? Once you convert, you are always Jewish, and nobody can take that away from you. And if there are rabbis out there who claim that they can, they are in clear violation of the idea that even somebody who converts and then is, let's say, bad at it, right? They're not keeping all the mitzvot, or they stray from the path, or they join another religion. That doesn't nullify. There's no nullification of conversion. That person can be considered off the path or in apostasy, but they're still Jewish. So I don't know if that settles your conscience at all. I would say if you're converting with a group of people, and this is the same rule for Orthodox rabbis as well. If you are converting with a body that thinks it can take away your conversion, I'm going to suggest you shop around a little bit, and that not everybody has that opportunity. So I don't want to, be harsh about this, but that just kind of grinds my gears a little bit. So it could be something that like you're just afraid, you don't know, but you've heard maybe, or you think that maybe they'll take it away. That doesn't happen. And if it does, you're not with the right rabbis anyway. So sorry that I got on my high horse there for a little bit. But things like that concern me. So Josh says it gets fun up here at times. Moose meat is a popular food here, but 99% of the time it's clearly marked. Never saw that before I moved to Alaska. Yeah, I can imagine in Alaska, there are some things that are more common than they are here in Southern California. You could probably get more goat down here than you can necessarily get in Alaska. So I've never seen a moose close enough to see if it has a split hoof. I think I'd probably be terrified. So yeah, sometimes you have to worry that different species are mixed in with bad food labeling laws and things like that. So if ever there's an excuse to eat less meat, I think kashrut is one of them. So, all right, we're going to wrap this up today. We've been going for about 90 minutes. I really appreciate everybody hanging out with me, and I'm going to wish all of you a Shabbat Shalom. My most heartfelt gratitude to you for learning with me this week. If people are just seeing my show for the first time and you've hung out for 90 minutes, thank you. Please consider subscribing to this channel. If you're watching now, if you've enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and that helps other people find it as well. And God bless you all, and until next time, heroes, peace.